She left him behind, fleeing a reality she couldn't face and building a life of luxury and success in the city that never sleeps. 2 decades later, destiny forces her to confront the son she abandoned, now a symbol of strength and resilience, and a family secret that threatens everything she has achieved. Can a belated apology erase the scars of the past? Or is it too late for redemption? Prepare yourself for a journey full of twists and turns, where the truth comes to light, love is tested to the limit, and the past demands reckoning. Haven Springs was the kind of small town where everyone knew everyone, with narrow streets lined by houses with porches and gardens full of wildflowers. Elizabeth and Ryan were radiant, expecting the arrival of their first child with a mix of excitement and nervousness. It was a dream they had nurtured together, imagining sleepless nights with baby cries and sunny days in the park. But life sometimes doesn't follow plans. Ryan always held Elizabeth's hand, saying that everything would be all right, but there was a tension in the air, that inexplicable feeling that something was about to happen. The Haven Springs Hospital seemed even smaller that rainy dawn when Elizabeth went into labor. The corridor echoed with hurried footsteps and medical orders, and the world outside seemed to have stopped, held in anticipation of that moment. Elizabeth took a deep breath, her hands trembling with fear and hope. Ryan's face, though tense, strained to stay calm, to be the foundation he always was. Little did they know that this long-awaited moment would be the starting point of an emotional roller coaster that would change their lives forever. Elizabeth had always been a practical woman, organized down to the last drawer, planning every detail of motherhood with precision. But not even she was prepared for what was to come. The baby's cry filled the room, but there was no expected relief. The doctor's somber and cautious expressions made Elizabeth hold her breath. Dylan. It was the name they had chosen for their son. But something was wrong, something no one wanted to say out loud. The doctor approached, her expression full of care, and Elizabeth felt a chill. The cold in Elizabeth's stomach turned to despair when she heard the words that broke her heart. Spina bifida. The life she had planned, the dreams she had for her son, everything seemed to shatter in a second. She couldn't understand, didn't want to accept that her son would face a condition that would affect every step of his journey. Ryan, on the other hand, held Dylan with so much love that it almost seemed to deny the tragedy of the situation. But deep down, even he knew that nothing would be easy. Time in Haven Springs passed strangely after that. Elizabeth barely recognized her own home, which was once full of life, now plunged into suffocating silence. Dylan's crib was in the next room, and Elizabeth avoided it, as if facing reality was worse than pretending it didn't exist. Ryan did his best to keep hope alive, inventing stories about how Dylan would be strong, a warrior. But Elizabeth felt crushed by the weight of guilt and shame, wondering what she had done wrong. The day Dylan was born never ceased to echo in Elizabeth's mind. The hours following the birth were a whirlwind of emotions, from brief joy to crushing despair when the doctors finally explained the diagnosis. Spina bifida. That strange term that changed everything, turning smiles into expressions of concern. Elizabeth remembered looking at Ryan, hoping he would say everything was all right, but his face was a mirror of fear and uncertainty. In that instant, their world changed forever. As Elizabeth looked at her son, so small and fragile, her mind couldn't accept the situation. She didn't want to believe that the plans she had made for him, the hopes and expectations she had nurtured, were about to crumble. Motherhood, which should have been full of love and pride, was tinged with a fear she never imagined feeling. Beside her, Ryan held Dylan with an unwavering look of adoration, as if that love could overcome anything. Elizabeth felt her husband's strength, but she herself was shattered. Ryan, always so practical, began to seek answers, information about treatments and therapies. He made calls, researched through sleepless nights, while Elizabeth felt trapped in a maze of emotions. How could he be so strong, so determined? She wondered repeatedly, feeling even more guilty. The love Ryan had for Dylan was pure, without reservations, while Elizabeth could only think about the life that had been taken from her. She felt miserably guilty but also terribly lost. Ryan's friends said he was handling things well, admired his dedication, and praised him as the father any child deserved. Elizabeth listened to these comments like daggers. No matter how much she wanted to, she couldn't connect in the same way. Every movement Dylan made seemed a reminder of what she couldn't fix, that her own inability haunted her. Ryan talked about Dylan's resilience, about how they would find a way, but Elizabeth didn't know where to find the strength to believe. Neighbors murmured around the corners, whispering things Elizabeth pretended not to hear. Every visit, every offer of help sounded like a reminder of her inability to be the mother Dylan needed. The world around her seemed to be waiting for her to rise, but she was stuck in darkness, in the humiliation of not knowing how to handle it. Ryan still believed, still made plans, but Elizabeth saw his dreams crumbling. How to move forward when all that was expected was a life that would never come. Mornings in Haven Springs seemed long and painful for Elizabeth. The blue sky didn't match the turmoil she felt inside. Ryan was like a rock, but even he couldn't reach the storm forming in her heart. Elizabeth saw other mothers in the park, chasing after healthy children, and felt completely broken. She wanted to be grateful for Dylan, wanted to love him as Ryan loved him, but there was an invisible wall between her and her son. A wall built of fear, pain, and endless despair. And so, while Ryan carried Dylan with pride, trying to show the world that their son was more than a medical condition, Elizabeth felt increasingly isolated. Their home, once full of dreams and promises, was now a reminder of what could have been. Ryan tried day after day to involve Elizabeth in the love he felt for Dylan, but she pulled away, creating a void that grew uncontrollably. Elizabeth began to distance herself, even without realizing it, from everyone around her. She spent more time outside the house, claiming she needed fresh air, that she needed to think. But thinking took her to dark places, places where the whispers of her own mind condemned her for not being enough. Ryan did everything to include her, but each attempt seemed to widen the abyss between them. The love of a mother, which everyone said was instant and indestructible, seemed an unattainable concept to her. Fear spoke louder. The doctors talked about the challenges Dylan would face: surgeries, mobility difficulties, constant care. Elizabeth felt as if she were hearing everything from inside a tunnel, where words arrived muffled and heavy. She blamed herself for thinking how difficult it would be, as if her own suffering made her selfish. But the fact is she didn't know how to be strong. The pain was like an invisible chain pulling her down. The exhausting medical routine, hospital visits, and the constant pitying looks from people around her became burdens she didn't know how to carry. Every diagnosis, every word confirming that her son would face insurmountable challenges, seemed to tear away a piece of her hope. Elizabeth began to feel like a spectator in her own life, unable to find the strength to face what was to come. The feeling of inadequacy was overwhelming. Ryan, on the other hand, was the image of strength and love. He spent sleepless nights beside Dylan's crib, holding his little hand, while Elizabeth hid in the bathroom, suffocated by guilt. She heard the encouraging words Ryan whispered to their son, promises that everything would be all right, but those promises sounded empty to her. Elizabeth wondered how he could believe so much, how he could face everything with an open heart, while she only felt fear and despair. One night, Elizabeth finally broke down. The silence in the house was unbearable, broken only by Dylan's soft breathing and Ryan's heavy sigh, who never stayed away from his son. Elizabeth looked at the small suitcase at the foot of the bed, a suitcase she had packed without much thought, but which now seemed a symbol of her imminent escape. The weight of the decision was enormous, but she felt she had no choice. She believed she was destroying more than helping, and that perhaps, in some cruel way, her departure was the only way to save them all. That dawn, Elizabeth left a letter for Ryan on the kitchen table, words written with tears staining the paper. She wrote that she loved him, that she loved Dylan, but that she was lost. She wrote that he was the strength of the family, the hero Dylan deserved, but that she no longer knew how to be part of that story. The words were full of pain, regret, but also a profound sense of relief. And then, she took the suitcase and left, without looking back, without allowing her heart to make her change her mind. The sound of the door closing was like an echo of an ending. Ryan woke up that morning and found the letter. The shock was immense, but there was no time to process. Dylan needed him. The life they knew had changed irreversibly, and now he was all their son had. He read the letter repeatedly, trying to understand how his wife's love wasn't enough to keep her. But even with a broken heart, Ryan knew he couldn't afford to fall. He hugged Dylan even tighter, promising that he would never, ever let him feel the abandonment that was now a permanent scar. Elizabeth went to New York, trying to lose herself in the city's hustle and bustle, in the promise of a fresh start. But guilt followed her, like a shadow she couldn't shake off. Even surrounded by constant noise, she felt terribly alone. Success began to knock on her door, but with each professional victory, there was an impossible void to fill. She threw herself into work, events, everything that made her forget the life she had left behind. But forgetting was impossible. The memories of Ryan and Dylan, the baby she abandoned, never left her in peace. Haven Springs moved forward, but Elizabeth's absence was felt. Ryan had to learn to be everything: father, mother, protector, and mentor. He dived headfirst into the mission of making Dylan feel loved, even without understanding how his mother's abandonment would affect their son in the future. Meanwhile, Elizabeth, in New York, tried to rebuild her life. Regret was a constant presence, but she clung to the idea that she did what she thought was best for everyone. But the heart doesn't lie, and the void only grew. And so, while Ryan became the mentor Dylan needed, Elizabeth became a woman haunted by the choices she made. Two worlds separated by miles, but connected by the invisible thread of love and pain. Dylan would grow up without knowing the mother who left him, while Elizabeth watched from afar, unable to erase the past. And time continued to pass, carrying with it the hope that wounds would heal. But destiny, as if knowing there were still stories to be told, waited patiently to bring everything back to the surface. Dylan, even so small, already seemed to absorb Ryan's strength. Every laugh, every movement, was a reminder that there was life, light, and possibilities, even in Elizabeth's absence. And while Ryan did his best to create a loving home, he also became the hero of his own story. He was the example of how determination and unconditional love can turn even the darkest days into moments of hope. It was a daily struggle, but a fight he would never abandon. On days when missing Elizabeth became unbearable, Ryan took refuge in Dylan's smile. He would sit on the floor with his son, play, read stories, and build a connection that no one could break. He knew he could never replace his mother's presence, but he was determined to ensure that Dylan grew up knowing he was loved above all. Every small milestone Dylan achieved was celebrated as a victory, proof that they could overcome even without Elizabeth. And that motivated him to keep going. Ryan never showed the pain he felt from Elizabeth's departure, but on silent nights, when Dylan slept, he cried in silence. He wondered if he was doing enough, if the love he offered could heal the absence of the mother. But even in those moments of vulnerability, he rose again, determined to be the strength Dylan needed. He knew that being a father and mentor was an immense responsibility, but it was a duty he embraced with a heart full of love. The improvised basketball court in the backyard became Ryan and Dylan's refuge, a place where they could forget their challenges, even for a moment. Ryan encouraged his son to love adaptive basketball, teaching him to see the world in a way where disability didn't define who he was. They laughed, fell, and got back up, and each of Dylan's laughs was a confirmation that despite everything, they were creating something beautiful. Years passed, and Dylan grew up with Ryan's unwavering support. The surgeries were many, the treatments long, but Dylan's strength always surprised everyone. He was the boy who never let adversity defeat him, much of which was due to his father's tireless love. But life in Haven Springs never ceased to present challenges. Dylan faced curious and pitying looks, and Ryan, always by his side, did everything to shield his son from the cruelty the world sometimes offered. Their proof was ongoing without rest. Jake, Dylan's best friend since childhood, became one of the most important allies in his journey. He was the boy who never saw the wheelchair as something that defined Dylan. They played basketball together in the backyard, and Jake helped Dylan train for the city's adaptive basketball team. The laughter was genuine, and Jake was a source of support that helped Dylan feel like any other boy. Ryan thanked him every day for that friendship, knowing that not everyone understood Dylan the way Jake did. But like every good story of overcoming, there were enemies. When Dylan started college, reality became harsher. He faced prejudice not only from peers but also from authority figures. The biggest of them was Mason Carter, a junior coach of the basketball team who saw athletes with disabilities as a weakness for the team. Mason was relentless, the kind of person who didn't hide his disdain for what he considered imperfect. Dylan had never faced such direct discrimination before, and the pain of that experience deeply marked him. What Dylan didn't know, however, was the dark secret that linked his life to Mason's. Mason, unbeknownst to anyone, was his half-brother. Elizabeth, in her new life in New York, had started a new family, and Mason was the fruit of that journey. Destiny, in one of its cruelest tricks, put Dylan face to face with his own blood, but in circumstances filled with pain and rejection. Ryan knew about this before Dylan did and felt his heart break once again. How to tell his son that the enemy who humiliated him was, in fact, part of his own story? Determined as always, Dylan decided he wouldn't let Mason win. With Ryan and Jake's support, he launched a campaign to sue Mason for discrimination. The local media quickly picked up the story, and suddenly, Dylan was at the center of a public battle. It was more than a fight for justice. It was a fight for the dignity of all athletes with disabilities who had been silenced or despised. Ryan, even fearing for his son, stayed by his side, knowing that Dylan needed to face this battle to continue growing. During this time, Elizabeth learned about the lawsuit and the attention the story was receiving. The news reached her in New York, and the past she tried to bury tormented her once again. She watched the reports about Dylan, seeing the strong and determined young man he had become, and guilt crushed her. Regret was a constant pain, a reminder of everything she had lost. But there was still no room for reconciliation, only for confronting the consequences of her choices. Elizabeth knew that a reunion was inevitable. Ryan was now becoming a counselor in a much more dangerous arena. He helped his son prepare for hearings, teaching him to be strong even when humiliations threatened to bring him down. Ryan knew this was another test in a life full of challenges, but he also knew Dylan was the warrior he had always said he would be. Each day was a battle, but also an opportunity to show the world that overcoming was more than just a word. It was a choice, a constant struggle. Jake continued to be one of Dylan's pillars of strength. He organized peaceful protests on campus, creating a support network that gave Dylan and other athletes the courage to keep fighting. But Mason's presence, always full of disdain, was a dark cloud hanging over everything. Dylan felt his anger growing inside him, an anger that came from both injustice and Elizabeth's abandonment. This anger, however, also drove him, made him keep going even when everything seemed lost. The trial was approaching, and the tension was palpable. Dylan knew the battle wouldn't be easy, but he was no longer alone. The town of Haven Springs, which had seen him grow, united with him, showing that love and support could overcome even the cruelest of enemies. Ryan wondered if Elizabeth would have the courage to show up, to finally face what she had left behind. And as Dylan prepared for what could be the greatest test of his life, there was a latent hope, a belief that the truth, in the end, would always come to light. The day of the trial had arrived, and Dylan's heart felt like an out-of-control drum in his chest. He was nervous, but his determination was visible in every feature of his face. He was there to fight for justice, for dignity, for all the moments he had been humiliated and treated as less. Beside him, Ryan offered an encouraging smile, the kind of smile that always managed to calm the turmoil Dylan felt inside. But this was no ordinary day. Dylan knew that the fight for justice was about to become even more complex and painful. The courtroom was full, and the energy was tense, almost oppressive. The case had attracted a lot of attention, and Dylan's name was on everyone's lips. He had prepared to face Mason Carter's prejudice, the coach who had discriminated against him, but still, the fear of the unknown lingered. Mason was sitting on the other side of the room, with the same cold expression Dylan had grown to detest. The cutting words, the humiliations, all echoed in Dylan's mind, but he knew he couldn't let fear dominate him. It was a moment of confrontation, a moment of truth. Elizabeth was there too, sitting among the spectators, and her presence made Dylan's stomach churn. The mother who had abandoned him years ago seemed like a stranger, but he couldn't avoid the whirlwind of emotions upon seeing her. For years, he had imagined what this reunion would be like, but he never thought it would happen in a courtroom, amidst a battle for respect and dignity. Ryan knew that Elizabeth's presence was an open wound, but he remained by his son's side, the unwavering support he had always been. When Elizabeth was called to the witness stand, Dylan felt his body stiffen. He didn't know what to expect, but the tension in the air was almost unbearable. Elizabeth began to speak with a trembling voice, explaining the years of regret, the shame that had accompanied her since she left Haven Springs. But then, she took a deep breath, and everyone in the room seemed to hold their breath. "There's something more," she said, and the fragility in her voice made Dylan's heart race even more. "Something that Dylan and Mason need to know." The courtroom fell into absolute silence as Elizabeth revealed the truth she had been keeping for so long. "Dylan Mason, you are half-brothers?" The words echoed in Dylan's mind, and the world seemed to stop for a moment. He felt the ground disappear beneath his feet, and his breath caught in his throat. Mason? The man who had spent years treating him as inferior, humiliating him in every possible way, was his brother? The revelation hit him like a punch in the stomach, and he didn't know if he felt anger, sadness, or sheer shock. Mason was also paralyzed, his eyes wide and his face incredulous. He looked at Elizabeth as if she had just destroyed everything he believed in. The disdain he felt for Dylan was now mixed with confusion and pain, and he seemed completely lost. Dylan stared at him, emotions overflowing, years of humiliations and disdain now tinged with the complexity of a blood bond he could never have imagined. The room seemed to close in around them, the truth crushing any notion of stability that still remained. Ryan, who had known this truth for years, watched with a heavy heart. He knew this moment would come, but seeing it unfold before his eyes was even more painful than he had imagined. He wanted to protect Dylan from the avalanche of emotions, but he knew this was a battle his son would have to face on his own. Dylan's gaze sought Ryan's, and for a moment, father and son connected in that silent pain, in that shared shock. Ryan tried to convey all the love and support Dylan would need to get through this new ordeal. Dylan slowly turned to Elizabeth, his face a mix of anger, hurt, and a deep sense of betrayal. "You're telling me that the man who spent years treating me like trash is my brother?" His voice trembled, laden with the pain of a lifetime. Elizabeth cried, but Dylan didn't know if he could forgive her. Mason, upon hearing Dylan's question, finally seemed to realize the depth of his own actions. He bowed his head, perhaps for the first time feeling the weight of everything he had done. But the revelation didn't erase the pain, nor the scars they both carried. The entire courtroom felt the impact of the newly revealed truth, but no one more than Dylan and Mason. The revelation had the power to destroy or, perhaps, to heal. But at that moment, it was impossible to say which path they would take. Dylan still needed time, needed to process the connection he never wanted and his mother's words who was still a stranger. The trial would continue, but the focus was now on an emotional battle that transcended the courtroom. The courtroom resumed session, but the atmosphere had been irreversibly changed by Elizabeth's revelation. Dylan sat in silence, still processing the fact that Mason, the man who had despised him so intensely, was his half-brother. It was as if all the humiliations he had suffered now carried a different weight, a cruel complexity he didn't know how to handle. Anger bubbled beneath the surface, but there was also a sense of loss, as if the truth had taken something from him he didn't know he possessed. Mason seemed like a ghost on the other side of the room, his usually cold expression now marked by visible confusion. He didn't look at Dylan, perhaps unable to face the reality that the person he despised so much was actually part of his family. The revelation had left him vulnerable, and he seemed as lost as Dylan. It was a moment where both young men found themselves groundless, and the courtroom, with all eyes fixed on them, felt too small to contain so much unresolved pain. Ryan knew that the ordeal Dylan was facing was more than a legal trial. It was an internal battle challenging all the love and resilience he had cultivated over the years. Ryan wanted to run to Dylan, hug him, protect him as he always had, but he also understood that his son needed to face this pain on his own. The weight of fatherhood had never seemed so overwhelming, and Ryan felt every emotion like a knife piercing his own soul. Elizabeth, still on the witness stand, cried uncontrollably. Her regret was evident, but she knew there was no turning back. She forced herself to look at Dylan, wishing she could alleviate the pain she had caused him. But the hurt in his eyes was a reminder that some mistakes are unforgivable. Dylan felt his mother's gaze but turned away. He wasn't ready to face her regret yet, didn't know if he ever would be. His heart ached, but there was a bigger battle he needed to win that day. Dylan's lawyer resumed speaking, trying to bring the focus back to the discrimination case. But the emotional intensity was palpable, and even the jurors seemed affected by the tension. Dylan took a deep breath, trying to concentrate. He needed to remember why he was there, not just to expose Mason, but to fight for the rights of all athletes who had been disrespected and marginalized. The pain from the revelation still consumed him, but he knew that somehow he needed to move forward, needed to honor the strength Ryan had always taught him. When it was his turn to testify, Dylan stood up with his head held high, though his legs trembled. He told his story, his voice wavering between anger and courage. He spoke about the years of discrimination, the nights he felt broken, but also about the strength he found in his father's love. Mason, sitting across, finally looked at him, and for the first time, Dylan noticed a crack in the coach's arrogant armor. It was as if the revelation of their blood bond had planted a seed of doubt, of remorse. Mason, who had always prided himself on his impenetrable stance, now found himself exposed. The truth disarmed him in a way he never could have predicted. He felt guilt eating him up, but didn't know how to fix everything he had broken. Dylan's words were like daggers, each one piercing deeper, showing the extent of the damage he had caused. But still, he remained silent, trapped in the snare of his own mistakes, not knowing if redemption was even possible. Dylan's testimony was powerful, a testament not only of pain but of resilience. Tears streamed down his face, but he didn't stop speaking. He wanted everyone to know that being strong didn't mean not feeling, didn't mean not suffering. The entire courtroom was moved, and even the jurors couldn't hide their emotions. Dylan was broken, yes, but he was also stronger than he could have ever imagined. And in that moment, he knew that, regardless of the outcome, he had done something important. Ryan felt a mix of pride and pain. Seeing Dylan face everything with such courage moved him, but it also reminded him of the invisible scars his son carried. He knew the path to healing would be long, but he believed in Dylan's strength. And as the trial continued, as the legal battle still unfolded, there was a silent understanding that the greatest victory would be emotional. It was a testament of love, strength, and a family marked by pain, but also by the possibility of healing. The trial came to an end, and the verdict was announced. Dylan won. The court recognized the discrimination he had suffered, and the victory brought a wave of relief and pride to everyone who supported him. The room filled with applause, but Dylan, despite the victory, still felt his heart heavy. He achieved justice, but the revelation that Mason was his half-brother continued to echo within him, mingling with the relief of the triumph. Ryan hugged him tightly, tears of pride and relief streaming down his face, but he knew that true healing was still far away. Dylan looked at Mason, who was sitting in silence, his head bowed. The man who had despised him for so long now seemed broken, without the arrogance he had always carried. Mason finally looked up, and for a moment, there was something resembling remorse in his eyes. But Dylan didn't know if he was ready to forgive. The hurt was deep, and the newly discovered bond made everything seem even more complicated. The pain was still raw, and the victory, though sweet, didn't have the power to erase years of suffering. Elizabeth, who had watched the trial unfold with a broken heart, approached Dylan. Regret and shame consumed her, but there was something more, a hope, albeit fragile, for reconciliation. "Dylan," she said, her voice choked, "I know I can't change the past, but I'm here, if you allow me." Dylan slowly turned, his expression loaded with ancient pain. He wanted to push her away, wanted to scream, but also desired something more, something he didn't know was possible: peace. Reconciliation was an uncertain path, but perhaps there was a chance. Ryan stayed by Dylan's side, the constant support he had always been. He knew his son would need time to process everything, but Elizabeth's presence brought forth emotions he thought he had buried. The hurt of being left behind, the responsibility he had taken on alone, it all was still real. But he also knew that Dylan deserved the chance to decide for himself if he was willing to forgive. Ryan, even with his wounds still open, wanted the best for his son. And that included giving Elizabeth space to try to repair what she had broken. The trial had ended, but Dylan's journey was far from over. As he left the courtroom alongside Ryan, he felt the weight of everything that had happened. The victory brought a sense of justice, but it also opened old wounds he didn't know how to begin healing. Elizabeth was nearby, watching from afar with her eyes still red from crying, while Mason slowly walked away, looking more lost than ever. Dylan knew that despite everything, he would need to find a way to move forward. Ryan, with the love and patience he always had, accompanied his son in silence. He knew Dylan needed time, that words of comfort wouldn't heal the immediate pain. But he also knew they were in this journey together, as they always had been. The town of Haven Springs seemed brighter under the afternoon sun, as if the universe wanted to give them a sign that better days might be ahead. Ryan hoped that hope, even if small, would be enough to help them continue. Dylan, no matter how much he wanted to leave everything behind, still felt consumed by conflicting emotions. Elizabeth's presence bothered him, but it also made him think. She had extended an olive branch, a timid but sincere apology. He still didn't know if he wanted or could accept it. But as they walked out of the courtroom, he realized that forgiveness wasn't a race, it was a process. The pain of abandonment wouldn't disappear with a simple gesture, but perhaps it could begin to be softened over time. Elizabeth approached slowly, respecting the distance Dylan seemed to need. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said, her voice choked, "for letting me try, even if just a little." Dylan didn't respond immediately, but he also didn't turn away. Ryan watched closely, always ready to protect his son if necessary, but also with a spark of hope in his eyes. He wanted to believe that the future could be less painful, that Dylan, somehow, would find peace. But he knew the path would be long. Meanwhile, Mason was outside, confusion and remorse still etched on his face. He didn't know how to face Dylan, or how to apologize for years of cruelty. But something inside him was beginning to change, a late recognition of the harm he had caused. He approached hesitantly, words choking in his throat. "Dylan," Mason began, his voice hoarse. I'm sorry." That was all he could say, and the silence that followed seemed eternal. Dylan looked at him and for a moment felt a new wave of anger, but also a small seed of understanding. Dylan didn't respond to Mason, but the look they exchanged was different this time. It wasn't a look of forgiveness, but perhaps one of acceptance that they both needed to process this new reality. Mason, seeing that words couldn't fix what was broken, took a step back, respecting Dylan's space. Ryan placed a hand on his son's shoulder, a simple gesture but full of meaning. They had faced so much together, and knew that the healing journey would require even more strength and patience. Jake appeared with a shy smile, trying to ease the tension. "Hey, hero," he said to Dylan, "how about a game of basketball to distract a little?" Dylan smiled, though it was a tired smile. Jake's friendship was a reminder that not everything was lost, that there was love and support that hadn't failed him. Ryan watched the two friends walk away, and a sense of relief finally settled in. Even if only for a moment, Dylan's laughter was a sign that there was hope. A few months passed since the trial, and life slowly began to find a new balance. Dylan still dealt with waves of emotions brought by the revelation, but there was a resilience in him that only grew over time. He threw himself into adaptive basketball, organizing a large charity event for athletes with disabilities. It was his way of turning pain into something positive, of making the fight for justice turn into hope for others. Ryan helped him every step of the way, proud to see his son transform suffering into strength. The charity event was a bright afternoon, full of smiles and laughter. Dylan, with his competitive spirit, organized games, workshops, and discussion circles about inclusion. He was the soul of the event, and everyone who knew him felt the vibrant energy he brought to every space he occupied. Ryan watched from afar, his heart full of pride, but also with a silent acknowledgement of the scars that were still there. Elizabeth attended the event, though she stayed more distant, respecting Dylan's space. She still felt like a stranger in her son's life, but she didn't give up trying to reconnect. When she stepped onto the stage to give a speech, The tension was palpable. "I know I can't change the past," she began, her voice choked. "But being here today, seeing everything Dylan has built, fills me with hope." Her words were sincere, full of regret, but also of pride. Dylan listened, and though forgiveness was still something he couldn't offer, he felt a small opening forming in his heart. Mason, who was also present, watched from afar, trying to understand his place in this new world. He had started attending therapy sessions, trying to process the truth that Dylan was his brother. The path to forgiveness would be long, but he was willing to try, to change. For the first time, Mason approached Dylan with humility. "I know an apology isn't enough," he said, his voice low. "But I'm trying to be better." Dylan didn't respond immediately, but the mere fact that Mason was trying was already a sign that something was changing. Elizabeth's speech moved everyone, but the biggest surprise came when she asked to play a basketball game with Dylan. It was a symbolic gesture, a plea for connection. Dylan hesitated, conflicting feelings still pulsing inside him, but with a small tired smile, he accepted. They played, somewhat awkwardly, somewhat emotional, and Ryan watched, tears welling up in his eyes. It was a moment he never imagined witnessing, mother and son, trying to build a bridge amidst the ruins of the past. The event ended with a feeling of renewed hope, and Dylan found himself surrounded by people who loved and supported him. He knew the path to healing would still be long, that forgiveness, both for Elizabeth and Mason, was something that would need to be cultivated over time. But that day, he saw that life had a way of surprising, of offering new opportunities for healing and reconnection. Ryan hugged him, and together they watched the sky change color, as if the universe was acknowledging every step of overcoming they had taken. Mason, for his part, quietly left, still carrying the weight of his mistakes, but with a silent determination to redeem himself. Jake, as always, was the first to suggest a celebration, and soon everyone gathered, laughing and sharing stories. Dylan still felt the pain of the past, but also noticed that the anger was no longer as overwhelming. He was beginning to believe that perhaps a future existed where wounds could be healed, where forgiveness, even if slow, could become a reality. Dylan's charity event marked the beginning of a new chapter, with small but significant attempts at rebuilding. Dylan and Elizabeth began meeting, without hurry, just exchanging conversations that gradually opened space for the possibility of reconciliation. Ryan, still Dylan's constant support, watched his son grow in strength and independence, adjusting to the role of a father who needed to give his own son space to find his journey. Mason also began to change, participating in community events and trying to correct his past mistakes. He still wasn't a substantial part of Dylan's life, but the effort was visible. Ryan organized a dinner that brought everyone together, a gathering full of uncomfortable moments and heavy silences, but also with touches of lightness and laughter, thanks to Jake. It was an imperfect but sincere attempt to unite the broken pieces of the family and begin a healing process. By the end of the night, Dylan felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in a long time. Although the wounds were still there, he began to believe that the past didn't have to define the future. Sitting on the porch next to Ryan, under the starry sky, Dylan realized he was stronger and ready to move forward. The end of this era brought a new beginning, full of hope and a promise that, even with scars, they would continue together, facing whatever came their way.